Thanks, everybody. So around the conference, the last few days, I've seen a lot of discussion about the complexities of marketing and the different ways you improve your retention rate and using big data and soft launches and trying to understand the dynamics of each market. So people are really understanding that the success of a game is way more than just inventing a good game. And as every year goes past, the complexities and the data and the way you market games becomes more and more complex. Strangely, at the same time, I hear people talking about localization as a binary thing. You either localize or you don't. Do you need to localize casual games or not? So to some extent, there's a perception that gaming and all these metrics are very complex, but localization is just like translate at the end, and you just need some good translators. So got a rather diverse range of people at this conference. So I'm talking about the top 10 mistakes to avoid. And I'm not doing this Letterman style. I'm doing this just like sort of sequentially in the order of development of a game. You don't need to know about that. I was introduced already. So starting point I have here is about internationalization. So internationalization is the process of preparing your game to go into different languages. So you don't just take the game and go. So firstly, you have to check does it support non-Latin scripts. Okay, nowadays, usually no problem with Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, but if Arabic is on your list, then you may find it's a problem because it goes right to left, and this means that all the rendering goes the wrong way around and can cause huge problems. Text expansion. If anybody here is from Germany, they'll know that English into German expands a lot, but it's not the most expansionary. Vietnamese is the most expansionary because there's a space between every syllable. And Thai is pretty bad too because you have to increase the font size for the same legibility. Are your strings separated from the code? If not, you're going to have all kinds of problems. Pseudo-localization is one step that people skip. Pseudo-localization means false localization, and the idea is that before you localize, you maybe just use Google Translate to simulate the process of translation. Or you could do double vowel. So extract all the English, search A, replace it AA, E with EE. What's the point of this? The point is this simulates the typical expansion that happens upon translation. So you can see if your interface breaks. Also, when you try to take your text out and put it back in again, if you see anything with a single vowel, it means you omitted it from what needs to be localized. So easy import and export. Some people seem to think that easy import and export means cutting everything into Excel and handing it off to the localization company. It's not really the most efficient way. A lot of localization companies can develop a faster way to do it for you. And in fact, there is already an interchange format. It's a form of XML called XLIF, which means XML localization interchange format. So, don't necessarily assume that your localization company doesn't understand Unity or Lua or all the different formats. So you don't want to be trying to paste back in translations blindly into your code. So the next step is what I call the different approach. When I say ion or rocket engines, I mean ion propulsion drive or rocket engines. So if you know your rocket ships, the traditional rocket ship, it just lifts off at maximum speed and very quickly attains maximum velocity and doesn't slow down from there. But the ion propulsion drive it slowly accelerates, starts off very slow, and over a long period of time gets faster and faster. So what I find is that a lot of clients want us to do, want us to throw all the translators on as fast as we can because we've got a really important deadline. Doomed. because you won't have consistency of terminology, you'll be getting poor resources, you'll be looking at resumes saying that's okay. It'll be all about getting as many people onto it as quickly as possible. Instead, if you have a test to test out translators and editors and the most difficult parts, and you slowly are testing and improving and adding translators, and maybe separating it into dialogue is different to user experience, is different to help, is different to naming all the characters. So more haste, less speed. Slow down, create your reference materials, analyze what needs to be done, and don't just throw translators at it. Reference materials. Okay, so again, another example the wrong way around, from Chinese into English. Famous game Street Fighter II. Sheng Long didn't actually exist as a character. Sheng Long was actually a type of punch, a rising dragon punch, and it was misinterpreted as a character. So reference materials, most important one is what I call a term base. A lot of people call it a glossary, but glossary sort of oversimplifies what it is, because a glossary to many people is just like a two-column source and target. What a term base is you create a definition of what the item is, what the spell is, what the weapon is, what the character is, and you have a screenshot of what that is, and you maybe say what part of speech it is. So you give as much context as possible, and you pull out all the items in inventory, and you put it into a well-formatted document. And with the professional translator tools, anytime they come across this word, it'll propagate up into their face, so they can't miss it. And this is much better than telling the translators, play the game, play all 42 levels, times all the different languages, because what they'll end up doing is playing the game to understand what the weapons and the spells do. So if you extract this out and do this at the beginning, this will save a lot of time. Style guide, is a character going to speak formally, informally? Who's the audience? Is it 17 to 24-year-old males? Is it casual games? And a style guide is a living document. So quite often you get a style guide going, and then a reviewer says, no, this translation isn't right, it's too formal, it's too word for word. Anytime that happens, you use it as a before and after example. So as new translators join the project, they see, oh, the client didn't like this. Why he didn't like this? Because you should never use the passive voice in this circumstance, because this pronoun is too formal. So the style guide is something that can keep growing and growing as you do similar games in similar genres and in new languages. So what you're doing is you're taking the information out of people's heads and putting it into a scalable document. Game Bible. Game Bible is like the characters, who they are, what they do, and again, the traditional approach sometimes is play the game, and you'll understand it. Well, if you're doing lots of languages, you've got a translator and editor every language. That's not a scalable solution. Screenshots. I was talking to a client who says, we don't have time to get you screenshots, but how difficult is it to get a native speaker in the source language to go through and pull out all the screenshots and explain this power makes you twice your size, and so on. Because it's all about getting context. By spending the time, instead of launching translators at the game, spending some time to get the reference materials in place. And a test plan. People say, oh yeah, we need to allow for a couple of hours testing on like 5 or 6 Android versions. Well, thanks guys. What do they test? I mean, you can have people just mucking around, or you can actually sit down and do it properly and say, yeah, well, they need to test this, this, and this. You can't test everything. So what is the critical stuff to test? Very often what you do is you take the most complex language, the longest expanding one, the Vietnamese or the German. Let's test that first. Don't test all the languages together. So do some testing in one language. Go back. Now I know where the trouble parts are. These are the key parts. Familiarization. Familiarization is basically where you, as the client, tell the translators and translation company, play the game to understand. Now, it is important. I'm not knocking it. They definitely need to understand the gameplay, understand the look and feel, understand, what it feels like a gamer going through. But my general recommendation is, if you're asking your translators to be playing more than 1 or 2 levels, you've got something wrong, because you'll end up giving them all this virtual currency, and everybody's trying to play through 40 levels just to figure out what this character does. So you're covering up your lack of preparation in doing the turn-based and doing the style guides and doing the glossaries. And at the end of the day, if any translator quits, all that gameplay and game familiarization has gone with the translator or the editor. So it's a balance. Certainly you need to play the game, but also you need to prepare your assets to localize in a scalable, repeatable way. Okay, this is a complex topic, actually. Completed game or simship. One of the biggest issues is trying to do a simship game in the same way as you would a completed game. So what's at stake here? With the simship, or a game you want to release shortly after the English or the Japanese or the Chinese, you want to release same time or a week or 2 later. So you've got to start on the localization process before the game is finished. This causes endless problems, because the artwork isn't ready, the text strings are still changing, the Android is 2 versions behind the iOS, and you can't give the game build to anybody to play or familiarize. So this leads to huge frustration, because translators start translating out of context, and then people come back and they say, no, this is useless, they don't understand the game, they need to be experts in MMO or similar game. But you can mitigate. Having a completed game is sometimes a luxury. So you can create assets in advance. So if you don't have the artwork, you can have conceptual artwork. If you don't have the artwork, you can have a description of what this thing does. Or you can even find out what's the closest title and get somebody doing familiarization in a similar game. So, okay, going the wrong way as usual, but for a point, if somebody has played many games of a certain nature, they'll know that this word in Japanese or Chinese should not be translated as task, it should be translated as quest. What tends to happen is a publisher gets a game and throws it to the localization company, and there's no time to start creating all these assets. But what they could have done is, at the point of negotiation with the game development company, they could have said, you need to have somewhere you guys have written down what all these spells and items and characters do. Maybe it's in Chinese, but that's a big start to just do the game without any localization, without any art assets or any reference guides. One more. Yes, okay, and you will have to do several iterations. There's no getting around that. If you localize the game before it's finished, you may have to change the character names twice or 3 times. And it doesn't matter if the text is changing, because with the modern localization company, we create what's called a translation memory. We have all the source strings and the target strings, so we don't have to keep retranslating. We'll be able to pick up what the delta is. So we'll just keep pushing through. Okay, don't worry, that string, you'll end up paying, if 20% of the text has changed between beta and alpha, you'll pay 20%. And that's the price you have to pay for simship. Don't have to worry about that they'll have to figure out and compare what's changed. They won't. With the modern translation software, that's not an issue. Here's probably the most controversial issue. A lot of clients say, we need the translators to be experts in this kind of game. So the solution is that we have translators who are also gamers. That would be great. That would be wonderful. But there's not so many of these unicorns that exist, because translators are primarily female professionals, and the intersect between gamers and professional translators is very low. So what's key to understand is, okay, gamers know games and translators know translation. That seems obvious, but you can use their strengths to your advantage. So the gamers, they know the terminology. They know how people speak. So they are the ones that can decide on the names of the items and spells and so on, because they've played similar games. So when we make the terminology, the frequently occurring terms, the mythology, you can use gamers to approve those and sign those off. Where gamers are weak at is dialogue, because they will translate word for word, not in the way that a professional translator will translate. So it's possible to use different translators for user experience, help, dialogue, and approving terminology. So talking to some of the biggest publishers here, they tell me when we use sort of gamer translators, and the terminology is great because they've played all the similar games, but the translations of the dialogue is weak, and vice versa. So you need to get the balance. Okay, if it's an ultra casual game, no problem. But if it's anything a little bit mid-core, a little bit specialized, then you'll need to find the balance of using gamers or professional translators. Cultural adaptation, obviously historical events, adult content, they all have different requirements and illegalities in different countries, different gaming monetization patterns. You know all about that already. But cultural adaptation, it does lead to some things. Like, you know, in Southeast Asia, for example, people are exposed to US television and US monsters and vampires, etc. So you don't really have to re-explain. So you may have more difficulty mapping Western-themed games into Japan and even India than you might do to Southeast Asia, where they have probably greater exposure. So looking at cultural differences in advance is a critical thing. Okay, and I think this is the last one, on-device testing. Again, if you don't do on-device testing, you just, even the simplest word, even the word Japanese, are you talking about the language or the people? Because it's just one word, and it's only when it's in context, in its place, you realize, oh, it means the language or it means the people. So no matter how good a translator is, the stuff out of context will be a problem. And you'll have issues perhaps with string concatenation. You'll have issues of text box being cut off, things not loading right on one Android device, very small screen. So, you know, with the proliferation, especially in Android, you have to find some balance of what you can test. But there needs to be an order to it. You need to be like, oh, just give a whole load of people a whole load of devices and tell them just to play the game. That's how it often is. That's not an efficient way. You need to plan to do it. Work out what's the worst case scenarios, what's the critical areas to test. Okay, and do realize, of course, Asian languages are definitely different. Different spacing. You know, you can always tell an English game localized into Japanese because if everything is left to right, nothing is top to bottom. The colors are different. There's no cartoon characters mixed in. Just because if you've localized a game to Spanish, from English into Spanish, German, French, Danish, Russian, there's less of a cultural difference about cultures, cartoons, tutorials, feedback. You're going to have greater differences in Asian languages. No spaces between words. It means that text doesn't fit into artwork in the same way. Fonts are larger. So if you've got text embedded into artwork, they may work okay in European languages, and then they may look kind of silly in Chinese, where you just got two little characters there sitting alone in an ocean of space. So you may have to redraw some artwork for Asian. Or indeed, if you got the other scenario I mentioned, like Vietnamese or Thai, which are even more expansionary, then you'll have real trouble fitting text inside that artwork. Characters are not fixed width. I mean, this is a thing often in mobile games. People try to say, well, we need you to keep these strings 6 characters long. Have you seen Thai characters? One can be 8 times as wide as another, plus they stack them up as well as across. So it just actually means nothing when you say keep it 8 characters wide in the context of Thai. And in the industry tools, there's a lot less support for Asian languages, especially if you wander away from the mainstream Chinese, Japanese, Korean. You'll find that Thai and Vietnamese doesn't have the same support. Also, more so than in Europe, gamers have their own speak, which in, say, since we're in Southeast Asia, I can say that they use a lot more transliterations. So in Thai, stun, there's a perfectly good word for stun in Thai, perfectly good translation, but gamers will always use satan, borrowed from the English. So that doesn't really happen so much in European languages to the same extent. I think what happens is, you see, in Southeast Asian countries, and countries that don't have a lot of games, they get used to playing English language games. So they pick up the lingo from the English language games, and then they want that lingo to be in the Thai language and the Indonesian language. This doesn't happen in European languages. So the processes you have for doing French, German, Italian, Spanish may be different when you go into Asian languages. And as you probably know, it's much harder to find experienced bilingual Asian people compared to Europe. Last one is a kind of a technical one, managing updates. Reference materials I've mentioned before. I also come back to this thing called the translation memory, which is this is a database of the source and target segments. And you need this in order to be able to change vendors. When you have an update, you run it against and it pre-populates the translations. So you need to think about who has ownership. We have all kinds of stories of vendors trying to change to us and the previous vendor refuses to hand the translation memory. CAT stands for Computer Aided Translation, but the other one is TMS. TMS is Translation Management System. So if you've got something really urgent, you can actually have these translation management systems. They can sit on top of a content management system. And if you have pre-approved translators, you can set up workflows that will automatically go to the first translator who picks it up. As soon as you finish, automatically go to the editor, automatically go to the client. No project manager sending files around. You can see online where everything is. So these kinds of sophisticated systems, ultimately you can go from sending Excel sheets to project managers and emailing backwards and forwards to an online cloud-based system which is delivering you translations in a matter of hours as opposed to a matter of days. So yeah, you want to have weekly bug fixes, live events, press releases, whatever. You want them next day, same day. The answer to this is usually technology as opposed to saying we want it now, we want it now. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. Any questions?